good evening. At least it's a lot better than last week's ice and snow, isn't it? Whoever it was who loaned me a scraper last week, thank you. Mine was safely home in the garage where it wouldn't get wet. Tonight we continue our study of great cities by going east, all the way to Shanghai, with a speaker who is uniquely qualified to explore it with us. Mario Gandolsonis, who is class of 1913 lecturer in architecture at Princeton, earned his diploma from the University of Buenos Aires and a certificate from the Center for Urban Research in Paris. He is a principal in the New York architectural firm of Agrest and Gandolsonis, one of the firms chosen to provide design services for public projects by the New York Department of Design and Construction. Professor Gandolsonis is an architect and theorist whose specializations include urbanism and semiotics. He has received numerous design awards and was elevated by the AIA to the College of Fellows, an honor awarded to members who have made significant contributions to the profession. Of his several publications, the one most pertinent for us is his most recent book, Shanghai Reflections, Architecture, Urbanism, and the Search for an Alternative Modernity, in which he examines the transformation of this old city of Shanghai into a modern metropolis from a broad cultural and architectural perspective. Sounds as if he wrote it just for this series, doesn't it? Let's welcome Mario Gandolsonis.
Thank you very much. Shanghai is such a vast subject that I actually decided to focus on it through a very special perspective, my own. And I thought that actually describing my personal experience would be a good way of entering into this very special world. First, a few notes on the city itself. Shanghai it's a very special city in China. In fact, if you talk to people in Beijing, the capital of China, they would say, well, Shanghai is not actually a Chinese city. And having lived in New York for 35 years, 36 years, I recognize that approach. In the same way as in most of America, New York is seen with a bit of suspicion. In a way, it's perhaps a symbol of America, but on the other hand, it's a bit foreign, very different from the rest of America. And Shanghai, there are reasons for Shanghai to be considered not a strict Chinese city. China has been ruled by emperors for over 2,000 years. The emperors exerted a total power. They were considered beings that somehow floated in some limbo between heaven and earth. And this despotic power was exerted over a people who were structured in a sort of what we would consider from our Western point of view a medieval way. China was always an agrarian structure, an agrarian country. Actually, one of my favorite historians, a French historian, wrote a book, a small book called The History of Civilization. And I always thought that what was interesting about that book is that he dedicated one chapter to China and one chapter to America. He considered those two countries exceptions with respect to the rest of the world. In particular, in the chapter about China, Brodel discusses the incredible intelligence of the way in which Chinese society had always been structured. Um, and he's always been interested in looking into societies through the question of food. And he describes the way Chinese people eat, have always eaten. The fact that they never developed this concept of cattle, and that they always base their diet on vegetables, where the protein was actually acquired through anything that moved, walked, swam. So in a way, he saw that as a very intelligent way of dealing with the environment and with the economic structure of the country. Shanghai was never one of the 5 imperial cities throughout those 2,000 years. Uh, Different dynasties, different um, em emperors lived, constructed, and lived in imperial cities. Shanghai actually was always a small town, a small city, although it grew pretty fast during the Ming Dynasty, that is after the 1300s. But it was just a commercial city. It was a port. Actually, Shanghai in Chinese means by the ocean or near the ocean. And it was strategically located. It became one of the important ports in China, although it was always second to Canton or Guangdong, the way Canton is called now. And an important element in the history of Shanghai is actually, or takes place in the 19th century during what was called the Opium Wars, when the British forced the emperor to, through obviously an act of war, to a series of concessions, among them actually what became an actual settlement in China for the British. That was in 1841, and a few years later, the French, who had been in China for a long time, almost since the late 18th century, acquired a similar situation and also a settlement. And the same year, or actually before the French, America had also established a settlement. And where were those settlements established? In Shanghai. That is, you could say it was a perhaps imperialist way of establishing embassies. Instead of buildings, they basically arranged with the emperor to acquire a very large territory next to the Chinese city of Shanghai. Now, the emperor gave them that territory, thinking of it as a sort of leftover space, a backwater space, a space without real economic value. In fact, those settlements became the most important part of Shanghai, the most important districts in Shanghai. So what's really important for us to understand about Shanghai is that Shanghai became a colonial city. The colonial powers built the Shanghai that we see as the historical Shanghai, and the Chinese city of Shanghai is only one of those, I would say, districts in what is today modern Shanghai. Well, this is China, and I'm showing you the location of Shanghai. in actually the southern part of China. Um, in fact, the Chinese sometimes say that you could divide China in half, the north being drier and the south being wet. And that's also reflected in their diet. That is, rice grows in the south. So Shanghai is basically water. That is, if you dig in like 6 feet, you find water. And obviously, as an architect, that becomes a major question and a major problem. And as you can see, my perspective is totally, and you'll see throughout the lecture, totally biased because of the particular way in which I look at cities. Now, this is Shanghai. This is a close-up. And what you can see is that there is a very important river, the Huangpu River, which ends on the Yangtze River and then the ocean. And in the next image, I'm showing you one of the oldest engravings that have been found that goes back to the period, the Ming period, that is the emperors who actually contributed to with two of the most important works, I would say, in the city, in the old city of Shanghai. And we're talking about the 15th century, the 1440s. The wall, the old city of Shanghai was walled, and the bureaucracy, the government, was kept inside the wall while everyone else lived outside the wall. The second important contribution of the Ming Dynasty was the building of the Yu Garden, the Yu Yuan, which is perhaps one of, well, it is the most important garden in the city of Shanghai, the most important public space in the city of Shanghai. This is another engraving, also dates back to the 16th century, and it shows in the foreground the Chinese city, but in the background the river, the Huangpu River. And a scene, now we're in the 20th century, but a typical street scene in the old city of, in the old Chinese city of Shanghai. Now, another important concept to understand Chinese culture is the question of isolation. That is, China, besides being one of the few civilizations that, all civilizations that still survive, was also self-sustainable as a society, and in a way closed to the rest of the world. There is a story that says that in the in the 13th century, in the 1200s, one of the emperors decided to explore the world and send a few ships around the coast of Southeast Asia. They actually bordered India, went almost as far as Africa, and they decided that there was nothing really interesting. They came back, and actually when we look into Chinese civilization and compare it to Western civilization, they were obviously far ahead at that time of wherever we were in the West. Now, this isolation was only broken, let's say China only opened to the West with, in the mid-20th century. Well, you could say that when Mao Zedong and the Communist Party took the power and became the official ruler of China, he brought a Western ideology to China. That is, he opened up China to communism, which obviously was not a Chinese native philosophy. Now, what's really interesting is what we could say how congruent is communism with the political system that the Chinese knew. That is this totalitarian system with a central government that was incredibly powerful, in a way translated very easily into the special communism that Mao brought to China. Now with communism, Mao Zedong brought also China, or in a way helped China to become one of the world powers. That is, in the 50s and 60s, there was an incredible transformation of Chinese society. Now, that didn't imply that China really opened up to the West or to the rest of the world, and it didn't imply that China changed its backward status. That is, from an economic point of view, the situation was rather catastrophic. Now, in 1978, after Mao's death, Deng created and proposed and created a new economic political system, what he called the socialist market economy. And somehow the system propelled China, and on one hand, what that implied basically is openness to the West and to other type of models, particularly the market economy model. On the other hand, he somehow let Shanghai grow and become a center, and what is now perhaps the most important financial center in China. Actually, with Mao, Shanghai was relegated to a totally secondary position vis-a-vis Beijing. After Deng, Shanghai grew and acquired a very, very important role in the economic structure of China. Actually, his successor, Deng's successor, Jiang, who was the next prime minister of China, was from Shanghai. And in a way, that explains also the growth of Shanghai in particular in the last 15 years. To give you a sense of the size of Shanghai, what's called the first ring, which is Shanghai proper, comprises a small territory where 16 million people live. Within the second ring, there are 30-some million people. And the status of Shanghai as the metropolis, which is basically the status of a province, because Shanghai doesn't have a mayor, there is a governor of Shanghai, where there are 65 million people living in the city. So that's basically to give you a sense of the enormity of the size, the density, and the population in this place. I thought that a few statistics would somehow give you a bit of a sense of scale. This is a view of this waterfront that was going to become emblematic of Shanghai. And actually, we're looking at the area that became the English settlement. And as you can see, there is a lot of construction going on at this point. Another picture with the low buildings, Western-looking buildings in that area. And now a photograph of the port. It's also a photograph of the early 20th century, and the Bund, which was this waterfront that was built in the 20s and 30s, teens, 20s and 30s, which is this magnificent facade or face of Shanghai, which is what we see today when we visit the city. On the other hand, the Chinese city in a way remained Chinese, although what I'm showing you is one of those few straight streets that have this Chinese character because they are located in the British settlement, but they've been in a way taken over by the local culture. Now, instead, here you can see the tramways in the old Chinese city. So this is just to give you a sense of the two faces of Shanghai in the 20s. An image of the one of the gardens nearby Shanghai, and this is actually the bridge where you access the Yuan Garden, and this is one of the few remaining structures. This is a very old tea house. For those who are planning to visit Shanghai, I would say this is a must. That is, you have to go to this place and basically go through the famous tea ceremony. But as I'm saying, this also dates back to the 15th century, that is, to the Ming dynasty. And this is not Paris. This is Shanghai. I'm going to show you a few mansions located in the French settlement that have been transformed into small boutique hotels, very fancy restaurants, or government offices. Another one of those mansions in the French settlement, another one. And they're still there, and actually you see now the renovated mansions, that is after they went through recent facelifts. Obviously they can afford to renovate the few buildings that remain because most of the Chinese city have been razed, and you'll see why. I'm saying they can afford it because China is at this point the country with the largest reserve in their central bank. I think at this point they have more than $1 trillion of reserves. And this is one of the gardens in the French district, one of the private gardens in the French district. This is Shanghai now. Now, the waterfront I showed you before is here. And this is the 21st century Shanghai. This is a city that was built in the last 15 years. And this is also Shanghai. That is, the Chinese streets were 12 feet wide. Obviously, you couldn't drive through the old Shanghai. You could only drive through the settlements and a few avenues that have been carved in the Chinese city. In 1995, the government decided to do something about traffic because the Chinese are totally in love with cars. And they decided to go through the city to build freeways through the city. Well, I personally thought that this was a horrible idea. I started to go to Shanghai in the early 90s, and I established, now comes my autobiographical section of the lecture. I established a program with the School of Architecture in 1995. That is, I first visited in 1993. It took us a couple of years to negotiate this program. And in 1995, the university sponsored the first year of the program, and then a donor made it possible for me to keep teaching, and I do that every fall at the School of Architecture. So I was there when they were starting to, they had just planned the freeways and they were starting to build them. And I thought, as I said, that this was not a good idea. I told them when in America we're demolishing our urban freeways, I gave them the example of Boston, you're building them. And they said, well, you know, we have a different idea of what these freeways are. And I said, but what about the spaces under the freeway, which are always dark, dangerous spaces? They divide the two sides of the freeway. They said, well, not in China. And it's true, you go there and you see fields of sports under the freeway, you see parkings for bicycles, you see restaurants, and you see gardens. You see, that is, the freeways are also gardens that go through the city. And in the evening, they're really spectacularly lit. So they become almost like, you know, one of the elements of the structure of the city, one of the most beautiful elements in the structure of the city. This is to give you a sense that despite the fact that the Chinese love cars, they still use bikes. And there are 6 million bicycles being used still now at this point in Shanghai. That's a lot less than 10 or 15 years ago where there were 12 million. This is a view of what's called People's Square, and I'll show you a close-up. You can see the skyline in the background, and you can see a couple of buildings. This building, which is a new opera house, and this building, which is a new museum that has been built in the last 10 years. This is the view of Pudong, which is what I was telling you, 21st century Shanghai, and this photograph is actually 5 years old. So there are a lot more buildings now. It's really dense, and they keep building. So, well, I would say I go to Shanghai at least once a year, usually twice a year, sometimes 3 or 4 times a year, and every time I go there, I'm surprised because I see something new. This is their stadium, and I'll go back to that because I'm going to show you a project, actually, a competition we won 3 years ago, where we were asked to plan one of their districts, a district that's perhaps the most affluent, that tourists don't know. That's where the young Chinese professionals and the new, I would say the new yappies live. And this is Nanjing Road, which is their Broadway, perhaps one of the most important avenues, and it's always been, but it didn't look like Las Vegas, which is what this looks like, or Broadway, or Times Square, which is what this looks like today. This is a new, renovated, old neighborhood. It used to be kind of, you know, like a workers' housing, and now it's perhaps one of the fanciest gentrified areas in the city of Shanghai. Of course, there is a Starbucks here. The Opera House and the Shanghai Museum. But life goes on, and you can still find scenes like these, not just in the Chinese city, but throughout Shanghai. I wouldn't recommend you to eat lunch or snack here. That's what Makosh tells our students. But everybody says the food is delicious. Another scene, and I'm afraid that these situations, these scenes are going to disappear pretty soon. But You know, we're trying to document them and enjoy them while they last. And another scene where you can see the modern city in the background, but then the typical daily life of Shanghai taking over the ground floor of the buildings, old and new. And another scene now in the Chinese city. There is a lot of green in Shanghai now. There wasn't green at all except the Yuyuan Garden. There are now 127 parks. The government decided that in order to maintain these new parks, they were going to ask for volunteers. And right now there are over 100,000 volunteers that take care of those parks. I'm going to show you now this project because in a way it's another way of understanding Shanghai through perhaps more pragmatic questions, and it will give you a different sense of what this city is about. Here you can see the three rings I mentioned before, this being the inner ring, and the red, the district where we are working. Now a close-up on the first ring and this district, which is called Shujiahui. This is the People Square that I showed you a few minutes ago, and this is Nanjing Road, which is that street that looked like Times Square. And this is the Wanpu River, and Pudong, the 21st century city, is right there. 1 million people live in Shujiahui, in this district, and there is a mayor. That is, every district has their own mayor. And then over all those mayors, there is the governor of Shanghai. This is a collage that we put together. This was what was there before they built this in the last 12 years. Thousands and thousands of apartment towers, between 25 and 35-story high apartment towers, without a plan. Now, that's why they call for this international competition. They always plan when things have been done. And in a way, very close to ourselves. Like, we build first and then we, like for me, you know, Houston is in a way the symbol of what's happening in China now. So they called, well, these are different views of this district. There is nothing besides apartment buildings and there is also a section of the old French Quarter, which is quite beautiful. This is an aerial photograph where certain blocks have been photoshopped, and then we realized that that's because some of the government people live there, so they disappeared from the aerial view. So we went to the CIA files and found everything. Now, these are the 5 areas that we've been working for the last 3 years. And in a way, we could work because they, all these areas in red are what they call areas for demolition. Now, to give you a sense, this is the size of Soho in Manhattan. So from their point of view, that entire neighborhood could be demolished and something new could be proposed. And that's basically the scale in which they've been working. This was our plan for those areas. And what we propose, first of all, you can see that there is a lot of green in this drawing. The original green, or the original parts were this one and this one. And what we proposed is a new public space in the center of the district where there are 6 department stores and shopping malls. The gigantic, actually, department stores and shopping malls where everyone in Shanghai comes to shop. Now, besides that shopping center, everything else is housing except this, which they call Sports City. and where the new stadium that I showed a few minutes ago is located. So they allowed us to demolish everything and transform what is now a sea of parking into a park. This is a neighborhood that was called the Interior Design Neighborhood, and that's where artists and craftsmen live, and that's where most of the people come to buy interior furnishings, furniture, lamps, curtains, drapes, etc. And basically the housing stock is so bad that it's about to collapse. So that's one of the reasons why they said that this area could be raised. This is a small area where a number of historical buildings exist. The Shanghai Cathedral, which is considered a monument, but also a number of 1950s structures they consider historical. And and this is an area of where the university, Jiao Tong University, which is right here, houses their teachers and their graduate students. And the government actually acquired this area and paid them quite handsomely so they can now build a few towers for their staff and buy, or build new buildings, etc. Or I don't think they have a concept of endowment the way we do. And we proposed a business district because there are no office buildings or for businesses that somehow exist now together with the apartment towers. And from the zoning point of view, that's forbidden. So they're trying to, in a way, transform what's illegal into a legal condition. So I'm going to go quickly through a number of proposals. For instance, this shows parking lots. And for instance, in this particular area, which I told you is the size of Soho or Tribeca in Manhattan, we proposed an underground parking that is the size of the entire neighborhood. So, and that's why I also mentioned the question of water, because when I asked if that was possible, they said, well, no problem, because we're now building 9 subways. So we can actually dig more for your parking lots. The same thing, everything that you see here is basically enormous parkings, underground parkings. This drawing indicates sidewalks. That is, one of the problems in Shanghai today is that the bicycles are parked on the sidewalks. So there is no space for pedestrians. That is, you can't obviously walk on the street because that's very dangerous, but you can walk on the sidewalks. So basically you can't walk. So, so we are proposing to create wider sidewalks, to actually create sidewalks where they don't have them. So it's a situation that, if you know the suburbs, is typical here, but you would never expect that that would exist in Shanghai. That is this lack of sidewalks. This shows the way we increased the number of parks and courtyards, green courtyards, because actually we were inspired by the Chinese garden, which is structured as a sequence of courtyards. And we use that idea to include courtyards and public gardens in every single area that we've been planning. And these are close-ups. This is obviously master planning and zoning. So this, what I'm showing you, are not real plans, but indications of how the area should be developed. And this is, again, these are not real buildings, but the potential that our zoning will provide to developers to build something that could look like this. And this is a model. I mean, everything needs to be presented both in drawings and models. This is that intersection where the 6 department stores and malls are located. And this is a 360 view of that intersection. And again, this is the present condition. There is no space to walk. So you enter those shopping malls from a basement level, straight from the subway, but there is nothing on ground. So what we are proposing is a new space, which is this space, which I'll show you here, with a very, very large fountain, and which will be actually a steam fountain during the winter and a water fountain in the summer, and a pedestrian bridge allowing for people to cross this very, very wide avenue. You can see the green medians, that is, we try to add green wherever we plan, and this is a view. Actually, the buildings in the background exist. So what we proposed is this square, this very, very large square with restaurants, with cafes, with places to hang out, which they don't have right now. And this is a close-up of the same space. And another close-up. Palm trees grow really well in Shanghai. So we decided to use this, give them a little bit of Los Angeles. And this is actually our proposal of planning for this arts and crafts neighborhood, which is basically, as you can see, a number of blocks. We took this enormous block and subdivided it in more normal size blocks. This is kind of the size of a block between Fifth Avenue, Park Avenue, and Madison, and 2 streets in Manhattan. So it's like 200 by 200, as opposed to this, which is 400 by like 1200. And organized with internal courtyards, which is what they already have, except that they are not green. They're basically storage place for bikes, cars, garbage, etc. So this is a model that shows you how this place would be organized. Obviously, it's very dense, but it would look small in relationship to the 35-story towers that surround the space. And this is a very diagrammatic view of the lower buildings that are only 4 stories high, with the first a ground level that has stores, retail stores, and a situation very similar to Soho again in Manhattan, where the artists and craftsmen would live and work in the same building. And the green roofs, etc., which is also part of the proposal for the project. And this is the present condition of Sport City. As you can see, a sea of asphalt, and this is a day where there are no cars. And this is our proposal. And this is the model. There is also, we proposed a convention center next to this area. And these are photographs of the mall, and this is a rendering of the future park. Now, the final project is perhaps the most interesting project. China had developed a very important film industry in the 30s, 20s, 30s, and 40s, and it continued throughout communism. And now they have a very, very powerful production company that works in joint ventures with Europe and with America, with Hollywood. So a lot of the films, Chinese films that you've seen, or Hong Kong films, are actually produced by the Chinese. Now, we propose to use this site and preserve some of these buildings to create what we call Film City, sort of paralleling Sport City, where the Shanghai Film Festival could take place. And this was the project as we proposed it, and then now this became our actual project. We are working with this production company for a real project. This is actually a view of all the different projects that we propose for the district. And this is the project that we're working on now for this film production company, where hopefully this Shanghai Film Festival will take place, although we will have to wait a few years for this building to be built. And this was our fantasy of a red carpet um, opening, sort of like the Oscars we're going to see this weekend. And this is the view from the avenue to this new complex. So I hope that this gave you a glimpse of what this fascinating city has become, as I'm saying, in just 15 years. And I'm now open to questions. Should we keep that image? Or?
You can turn it off if you want to.
Whatever. Yeah. Okay. Yes.
I'm interested in sort of the politics of development in Shanghai. How would you contrast it with that in any other place where you've worked?
Well, it's very peculiar. I actually I work here in America, and actually not just in the East Coast, but I've been working in the Midwest also for almost 20 years. So I know very well the American situation, and as I don't know to what extent you do know that most of what's being built in our country is built by the private sector, by developers, and that in America, government usually does not build. I mean, the government used to build for a period with FDR. Government actually undertook a number of projects, but they don't do it anymore. Now, I also worked in Europe. I worked in France, and I've been a consultant there. And what's interesting is that in France, government has a very, very special role in the building of, in particular, in the building of housing, in the building of public spaces, in the building of very large landscape projects. Well, China, at this point, looks more or is organized more like the US than Europe. That is, development is basically done by the private sector. How? Well, there are very different circumstances and very different situations. In general, the city promotes development. That is, in this case, for instance, the district will use our plans to open up offers from developers in order to actually plan and build the actual projects. The difference is that they are a lot more prone to negotiation. That is, they are, first of all, they didn't really have rules or zoning codes or design guidelines until recently, and we've been working in a way educating them about how to develop these regulations. Now, the regulations are actually, as you know, here they're very strict, and it's very, very difficult to negotiate things, and the developers in New York in particular know very well how to negotiate, and they get away with murder many times. But they have to pay for that, a social price or a real price to the city. Here in China, the negotiations, when they exist, are conducted the Chinese way. That is through connections or through power. In one of the projects, for instance, we were given a site, and then we were called, the government called back and said, well, the site has been reduced. And we said, why? Well, because a section is now being built. We said, how come you didn't know? Well, those things happen, actually. That site belonged to the army. So what I'm saying is that it's actually different, but somehow quite close to the way we work here. Yes. I'm sorry. Here, I think I.
Given the rapid scale of construction
in land that has water, a high water table. What about the infrastructure for sanitation to accommodate this enormous explosion?
Well, that's an excellent question, especially the sanitation aspect of the question. There is no sewage in Shanghai. There is never been sewage in Shanghai. There is sewage now in modern Shanghai, but all Shanghai, it's still the same. That is, those houses, those very picturesque, beautiful Chinese houses, don't have bathrooms. So there are public bathrooms in the neighborhood, and what you see in the morning is usually the grandmothers going with 2 bags, that I don't want to describe, going to public space places because there is no, as I'm saying, there is no infrastructure. So in fact, when people ask me, well, in order to build the new neighborhoods, a lot of people have been displaced. So what's the social cost? So I told him a story. I went once with my students to an area that was supposed to be raised, and the students, young students, Princeton students, went, talked to the people who were there, and asked them, "Are you sad that you're being moved to another place?" And they said, "We're more than happy, because we're going to get houses with bathrooms and kitchens." So it's very different situation when you compare it to our situation. Now, they are building, as I'm saying, infrastructure for the new areas and for the new buildings, but they do as little as possible in relationship to the old city, because as someone explained to me, infrastructure is invisible. And politicians actually don't want to spend money on things that are invisible, because they want to go up the ladder and they want to go to the next job. So they usually spend their money in things that are very, very obvious and very visible. That would be another facet of this situation. There was a question over there, yes, and then I'll take your
Could
question.
you say a word about solar energy with all these new buildings going up? Is China open to?
Well, we've been asking those questions for a long, long time. That is, when I first came there and I saw that they were raising every single building, I opened up the question that in 10 or 15 years, Shanghai was going to look like Dallas. And they were going to lose tourism, which is a huge industry, because why would you go there and go through the jet lag when you could actually just fly 3 hours and see the same thing, except that you would see there multiplied times 20. So in a way that pushed, because I was working with people who were very high up in the hierarchy, the planning hierarchy and the architecture hierarchy, and I explained to them how we landmark buildings, how we protect buildings, and they started to do that. And they actually, in a few years, they landmarked 200 buildings. And then the most difficult question, which is what they're dealing with now, is landmarking entire districts. And that's very, very controversial, because the government doesn't want to do it. So these are, let's say, the intellectuals or people who are interested in, in historical questions, pushing for that. However, I see, I have hope, because what's happening is that most people in government are very young. They're in their late 30s, early 40s, mid 30s to mid 40s. I've been going, as I said, to China since 1993, 92. One of the first architects I met had just graduated from the PhD program, and he was probably 25, 24, 25 at that time. Well, right now, he became the chair of the School of Architecture, a very bright fellow, He then moved to become the vice president of Tongji University, which is the university I work with, and he's now the principal planner of the city of Shanghai. Now, he's an intellectual. He is someone really interested in preservation, and he immediately put together a team to landmark and to preserve entire areas of the city in a very intelligent way, because they understand, I mean, he's in a way very American and very pro-market, so he understands that you cannot freeze a city. You cannot freeze a district, that development is actually also the lifeline of the city. And so he proposed different type of categories of development, areas where you can touch, areas where you can add, areas where you can demolish. So they're doing, I think, a very, very good job in that sense. Yes.
Given what you said about the ground conditions, I was just curious if there are any special challenges in building foundations for these, look like 50, 60-story buildings in the
Well,
Pudong area.
Actually, I didn't answer the question about solar energy. So when I mention the younger people, I should say that they are definitely interested in sustainability. They're interested in all those issues. And for instance, I do know that in Jiaotong University, which is more technical and more inclined to engineering, they are working very hard and very fast on hydrogen fuel for cars. And the government is investing an awful lot of money in alternative fuels, and because they, on the other hand, they do like cars, and they are building freeways. So they know that at a certain point they will have to do something about this. The water question is a major question, but not structural, because as I said, they are, I mean, technically you can solve all those problems, and when you have water, you can basically design a building as a ship. That is, the building ultimately floats. But the major question is actually the lack of water in most of China, and the fact that they are draining their resources. And we have to remember that they are officially 1,300,000,000 people, but there are also, the way we have those illegal people, well, they have uncounted people, and they say that there are another 200 million non-counted. So you're talking 1.5 billion. And 1.5 billion people drink a lot of water and use a lot of water. And that will become, in a few decades, a huge problem for China. So they're also working with some of Middle Eastern countries, and I think even Israel, on desalinization and in projects that basically are looking for alternative ways of creating drinking water. Yes.
Yeah, I really enjoyed the lecture, and I think what was most startling was to see all the changes, some of which seemed very positive, some negative, looking at those big malls and then the freeway going through with the nice parks. And I guess, I was trying to project myself in and say, would I actually like to go there? Would I like it? I can't get a feeling of that. And I wondered if you like it, picking up on the autobiographical part. And even more than that, thinking about not the Westerners, but the Easterners, from the social and psychological point of view, will they like it? And are people looking at the impact of the sense of place as it changes on the people themselves?
Well, again, this is very personal, but until I went to China, I was never really interested. I always thought actually that I've had plenty in this life with the Americas and with Europe. And Northern Africa, which I know, but again, I've never been interested in the rest of the world, I must say. And because I always rather focus on something than see everything. And somehow, because of special circumstances, actually, that's the way things happen in life, a client, a very young girl who was 18 or 19 and who then I knew belonged to the wealthiest family in Taiwan, became a client. She came to New York, she applied to Columbia, she hated the dorms, She asked her daddy to buy her an apartment, came to see us, and see if we could advise her. And this was in 1992. And she took us to see three places. One was the Trump Tower, the other one, well, there were apartments that were worth $2 million, $3 million, and $5 million in 1992. And this was for her instead of living in the dorm. So in a way, the family was extremely happy with our design and our work and invited me to visit them in Taiwan. And actually, I thought that I wasn't interested at all in going to Taiwan, but I was curious about China. So I thought that this would allow me to get into China. And actually, I made it very explicit. I said, well, I'm coming, but I actually want you to connect me to China. And they explained to me that in order to get to China, this was 1992, I needed to go through Hong Kong, and that was the connection. And I was really fortunate because they connected me to someone in Hong Kong who at the same time connected me to the dean of the School of Architecture, who happened to be a Princeton alumni. And I must say, he opened all the doors for me. He said immediately, I'm getting ready for 1997. So he had already established relations with China, with mainland, with the major universities. And because he knew Princeton, he said, go to Shanghai and go to this university because that's the one that's going to feel closer to you. He immediately said there are 4 great universities, the equivalent of our Ivy League. And he said consider the first is the one in Beijing, but that's okay for Harvard. It's not the place. It's not a place for you. And he said it being an alumni, so he knew the sensibility, our sensibility. And well, I went there, and it was like love at first sight. You were asking me what was. Well, it wasn't really just the place, because it took me a while to understand that. But the people, you see, so open and so, well, they love America. And it's their model. And one of the first things the kids will tell you is that we would like to be like you. And it's going to take us a while, but so obviously that predisposes you to like them. And well, the other fascinating because since I'm giving you this biographical story, something that I always thought, having been here for 36 years in America, but coming from 2 other major cities. I was born in Buenos Aires from European parents, and then I studied in Paris, and then I came to New York. And I, in a way, always felt that there was, first of all, I was always attracted to big cities. But Shanghai, in a way, by association, gave me a sense of lacking something, which was obviously something that we all lacked, which is America in the transition between the 19th century and the 20th century. That is, this is for me something that always fascinated me, how this country transformed itself into what became the most incredible, powerful, brilliant, I would say, adventure of the 20th century in those few years, in those few decades. And when you read stories, which I read from my point of view, architecture and planning, the way the skyscrapers were invented, the way New York and Chicago grew, in the first Chicago in the late 19th century and New York in the early 20th century, how the subways in New York, the entire infrastructure was built at the beginning of the 20th century, how the Empire State Building was built in 11 months. I always had the sense that I missed something unique. And in a way, I felt that I recovered that through Shanghai. Because I saw it changed in front of my eyes. Like, as I said, I would come back 6 months later and there would be a new highway, or there will be a new district, or there will be a new park. And the speed of development hasn't stopped. Beijing decided, because most of the important art takes place in Beijing these days. The artists, well, they have the support of the government, etc. So they invented the art district, which is really fascinating, which is equivalent to our Soho. And actually, they made it. If you follow the auctions at Sotheby's, Chinese art didn't exist. Auctions of Chinese art didn't exist a few years ago, and now they sell for $1 million, for $2 million, paintings of new Chinese, artists. Now, they decided that they wanted to have their own Soho in Beijing, and they built it in 3 years, 4 years, in an all-industrial district. So Shanghai, they're extremely competitive. They say, well, if Beijing has their district, we'll do it. So they took me 2 years ago to a place, which was also a derelict place full of abandoned industrial buildings, and they said, this is going to be our Soho. I said, great. And they took me to different places, and they were already squatters, like artists squatting in those buildings and painting and living and doing stuff. I came back 6 months later, and the entire place was a construction site. And if you go there today, you have to go there because the cool restaurants, the cafes, the best galleries are there. And you could never imagine that that place didn't exist 2 years ago. So what I'm saying is that frenzy and that inventiveness and that energy, it's unique. I come back to New York every time I come from China, and I have the feeling that I used to have in the 60s when I would go to Europe. Europe is old and looks old, okay? Well, New York feels like a historical place to me. Okay. Well, I don't know. Well, if there are more questions, I can answer them informally outside.